Hello and welcome to the 2017 imagineNATIVE Industry Series, and thank you to the support of CBC and CBC Docs, who are our Industry Series presenter for 2017. My name is Daniel Northway Frank, and I'm the Industry Director here at the organization. I'd like to acknowledge the Dish with One Spoon Treaty and give thanks to the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat for the privilege of working and living on their territory. We're pleased to present 2167, Indigenous Storytelling in VR, an imagineNATIVE industry series and TIFF Higher Learning event offering a creative and cultural discussion accompanying the complete exhibition of 2167 works with some of our speakers today. 2167 is running in the TIFF atrium downstairs if you haven't checked it out yet, now until December 31st, so if you're too busy watching screenings, come back another day, as well as traveling to 12 stops across Canada from October 25th to December 21st as part of 2167 on tour. So we're going to Vancouver, well, our first stop is Yellowknife, then we go to Fredericton, Silverways Film Festival, then we go to a lot of other places. Go to the website, imagineNATIVE 2167 on tour for more information. 2167 is commissioned and produced by TIFF, imagineNATIVE, PINGWAC, and the Initiative for Indigenous Futures, and is supported by the Government of Ontario and the Harbinger Foundation. The Initiative for Indigenous Futures would like to also acknowledge the support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, the Trudeau Foundation, the Canada Council for the Arts, imagineNATIVE as well, thanks them, and the Concordia University Research Chair in Computational Media and the Indigenous Future Imaginary. 2167 is presented as part of Canada on Screen, TIFF's year-long celebration of Canada's sesquicentennial. A big thank you to our following partners for making Canada on Screen possible and completely free. Our presenting partners, the Government of Canada, RBC, and the Government of Ontario, and our supporting partners, Telefilm Canada and Fairmont Hotels and Resorts. Before we begin, I would like to thank the generous support and continual support of the Canada Media Fund, who supported several amazing discussions that we've had so far and the one that you're listening to today. So in a moment, I will be inviting Sandra Collins, VP, Operations and CFO of the Canada Media Fund, to say a few words after we watch this short CMF promo reel.
Hi, good morning. It's a great turnout here this morning. So that was a little bit about the Canada Media Fund, and we're very proud to be at the epicenter of the funding ecosystem that supports innovation. We believe that Canadian and international audiences should be able to access and enjoy compelling content on the platform of their choice, anytime and anywhere. In this context, the CMF has made a strategic decision to invest in an ever-growing number of VR projects as an important part of the funding it provides to Canadian digital media. Canadian companies are at the forefront of digital media innovation. Thanks to the reputation of Canadian digital media content, the expertise acquired by producers, and a funding system that supports innovation and creative storytelling, Canada is well positioned to lead in the promising VR market and to respond to consumer trends. Among the CMF-funded VR projects, we have documentary series, games, educational immersive experiences, cultural VR applications, and enabling technology that is impacting the way we produce and experience content. Since 2013, the CMF has provided over 24 million in support of 59 VR and AR projects developed by dozens of studios across Canada. Content producers are turning to VR as a way to create experiences that push the limits of art and technology, offering immersive VR content from new and unexplored perspectives. VR content creators have literally widened and deepened their horizons when consuming this type of media. Recent months have seen a succession of major VR and AR announcements, confirming that these technologies are gaining in importance. With the launch of many VR headsets, virtual reality seems here to stay. It has a huge growth potential, and it raises expectations. Despite the clear enthusiasm surrounding this promising market, virtual reality's popularity will depend on a series of factors, including the ability of producers and creators to bring to life stories with diverse perspectives. In addition to our Aboriginal program that supports Indigenous storytellers, the CMF is committed to supporting Indigenous creators that use innovative platforms such as VR. That's why the CMF recently spearheaded a national effort to create Canada's Indigenous Screen Office to support the development, production, and marketing of Indigenous screen-based content, regardless of the medium or platform. The quality of VR content is improving exponentially thanks to the creativity and innovation of creators around the world, many of them Canadian and some right here in this room. The opportunities are immense. Even if the technology is still quite nascent, virtual reality is catching on quickly. Consumers are increasingly hungry for content on a growing number of platforms and devices, including VR. Recent forecasts from the International Data Corporation put worldwide revenues for AR and VR at over 160 billion US dollars by 2020. And in Canada, consumers are expected to spend over 600 million on AR and VR services this year. So there's significant growth opportunities in this technology. The emergence of these new types of immersive experience brings with it not only technological innovation, but also innovation in creative writing, storytelling, and audiovisual language, whose grammar is currently constantly being refined. This is especially true for Indigenous creators. The art of storytelling in virtual reality offers a point of view and presence of place, space, and environment that could be compared with Indigenous oral storytelling traditions. How are Indigenous artists bringing their worldview and concepts of time and narrative to this new medium? How does this relate with Indigenous futurism movement? What are Indigenous creators learning throughout their ventures into the world of VR? So for answers to all those questions and many more, we'll turn it over shortly to our panel for a wholesome discussion on that. So turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Sandra, and again, thank you to the CMF. So we're about to get started. So this engaging discussion brings the creative, cultural, practical considerations and reflections of the festival attending Indigenous filmmakers and artists of the 2167 initiative, Danis Goulet, Scott Benesiinaabandan, and Raven Chacon of Postcommodity, who are commissioned to create VR projects envisioning Indigenous life 150 years into the future. The art of story creation in virtual reality offers a point of view and a presence of place, space, and environment that may be the closest comparison yet to Indigenous oral storytelling practice. How are these artists bringing their worldview and concepts of time and narrative into this medium in conjunction with the Indigenous futurism movement? And what are they learning through their first forays in VR? We'll hear very shortly. So on with the discussion. I invite all of our artists to come up, and as well as Jason Ryle, imagineNATIVE's artistic director, who conceived of the 2167 project.
Thank you, Daniel. Hello, everyone. I'm Jason. Once everyone's seated, we'll have each of the guest artists introduce themselves. Scott, can we start with you, please?
Scott Benesiinaabandan, Montreal-based.
Sure. And your work is?
Oh, my work is Blueberry Pie Under a Martian Sky.
I'm Raven Chacon. I'm a composer and artist. I'm here representing my collective Postcommodity, which also consists of Cade Twist and Cristobal Martinez. We're based out of the Southwest United States, coming from different tribes down there. And our piece is called Each Branch Determined.
Hi, morning. I'm Danis Goulet. I am a filmmaker, and I made the VR piece, The Hunt, which was shot on 6 Nations in the Mohawk language. I'm Cree Métis, originally from Saskatchewan, and I make my home here.
Thanks, everyone. 2167 was first conceived several years ago, I think 4 or 5 years ago at this point. And at the time, under our former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, there was a fund, Canada 150 at the time, that was different than the incarnation that it became under Trudeau. And at the time, I think it was about 2012, looking ahead and trying to conceive or think about what, if anything, imagineNATIVE would do to commemorate 150 years of Canadian Confederation. I was trying to think of what could we possibly do, again, if we would do anything. And as a lifelong comic book and sci-fi nerd, I was like always fascinated by our culture's ideas and stories of the future. Very often, you know, growing up, you hear stories which were omens or prophecies, if you want to call them that were really didactic teachings about how to live today for a better future. But I never really heard anything specifically about a linear idea or concept of the future, at least from my perspective. So I was always very interested in this idea, and also this idea of the multiverse and parallel universes. And so much of that incarnation of Canada 150 was really centered and focused on the celebration of the past 150 years. And we thought, right, no, that's just not what we're going to do. Let's look forward. Let's look ahead 150 years. And as a programmer, I've been programming for imagineNATIVE now for 15 years, we get so few sci-fi works, and again, as a lover of science fiction, really wanted to see more of this come through our doors at imagineNATIVE and be presented to audiences. So I thought, wouldn't it be fantastic to get a bunch of Indigenous artists together to envision 150 years in the future to 2167. And we're very fortunate to have these three, as well as others, to take up the challenge. So let's start there. Danis, can you start off with the entry point, how you were approached, what the challenge and the idea of this project meant to you and your body of work?
Yeah, it's funny. So right before you guys approached me to do this, I'd made actually sort of a fantasy film called Awakening, which was this project that was celebrating the 100-year anniversary of the Elgin and Winter Garden Theatre in downtown Toronto. And so, again, it was sort of like, how do you think about a celebration of the past? And instead what I did was took 2 Cree characters, which were sort of, and this was also a space, the theater itself was a space that you see like these big names up on the wall, like Shakespeare and things like that. And I was thinking a lot about the classics and the way we think about classics, but everyone's just always talking about Euro-Western classics, by the way. And so I thought, you know, who are our classics? Who are our infamous characters? And so I took Wisagichak and Wheatago, which are 2 of the most well-known characters from the Cree oral storytelling tradition, and I placed them in the theater in a dystopian future, meeting up in a future. And in my mind, I was digging into the history of the land that the theater stood on. So even going back prior and saying, you know, what is the story of this place? But also, this is not Cree territory. So I brought that lens to it and started digging into, I guess, thinking about place, but also the stories that have come before, the stories that are happening now, and the stories that have yet to be. So I wanted to talk about that space and think about that space, that theater, as not just something that was the past or like go back to some kind of like period piece in the commission, but really like delve and push forward into the future. So when you guys came to me with this project, it was like another exciting opportunity to do that.
Excellent. Raven?
Well, we were approached to do this project and to actually go up to Concordia and work with AbTech and IIF, right? Is that what Indigenous Initiatives for the Future? Jason Lewis and Skawanati and their team up there. And VR was completely new for us in Postcommodity. We come from a background of some Cristobal Martinez mostly of using new media and tech and coding. So he was very excited to jump into that, and we've worked some with video and sound. So of course that was going to end up somehow into our piece. But other than that, VR was completely new to us. I think I had been the only one in the collective who'd put on one of those headsets before, and so we were skeptical at the same time of what this technology is. A lot of it coming from a background of gaming, entertainment. We were trying not to make a toy for anybody to come and just put on and have a good time and and then maybe just go on to the next one. We wanted something that was ambiguous, something not entirely didactic. Perhaps something disorientating. So we spent a few months up, working on this at Concordia, making trips to go up there, and thought of the possibilities of using video, or even at one point thinking of something that was completely sound-based, perhaps with very little visuals. But we ultimately decided on using animation in this and working with the team up there because they had a great team of artists and animators, and we just wanted to see what kinds of ways we can work with that technology and perhaps even try to break that technology. So a lot of our time was experimenting with that experience. I'll talk a little bit about what the piece is if you haven't seen it. When Postcommodity thinks up works, we have a general idea of what the piece might be about, but we don't have a set idea collectively a lot of times about what the piece is, and that's great because that allows for different interpretations of our work. My interpretation of this is that you are putting on a headset that isn't perhaps showing you 150 years into the future. It's perhaps showing you a document of something that is 150 years in the future, but you're looking at it perhaps 300 years into the future. So you're looking backwards to see this document. And what the document is showing you is some kind of visual representation, perhaps trying to render itself through animation or through whatever obsolete technology exists 300 years in the future that is 150 years old. And what you are seeing when you put the headset on is that you are in the middle of some kind of forest fire, perhaps, some kind of catastrophe. Your entire forest is burning down around you. This forest is supposed to be the mountains of New Mexico. And as you're traveling, running away from this situation, you are seeing objects in the field reminding you that there's still some kind of technology and intelligence in this surrounding. And as you progress through the world, you see what looks like the ruins or the meltdown of Los Alamos National Laboratories, which is where the atomic bomb was made. This area is also where Cristobal is from, and also my father is from this area of New Mexico. So it's a place that's very close to us and is part of our contemporary history still to this day. So you continue traveling on, and you also see these holes in the ground, which look like maybe they were bombing sites. Again, another site in New Mexico, perhaps White Sands. But as you've progressed through this, you start to contemplate perhaps that this isn't a forest fire caused by some kind of war or some kind of climate change, but perhaps this is a controlled burn. And perhaps you're not seeing the ruins of Los Alamos, you are seeing Chaco Canyon. And perhaps you're not seeing a bombed earth, but you're seeing kivas, sites of prayer. And ultimately, you end up in a place where the VR experience, or this document that you have been experiencing, goes into some kind of reset, and you're experiencing a completely different realm from that point in the VR experience onward. Throughout all of this, you are hearing a monologue, a voiceover of someone reading a plumbing manual for California Plumbers Code, perhaps some other artifact that has been found 300 years into the future that has survived. But this plumbing manual at the same time sounds very technical and very robotic as the man is speaking it, but at the same time it tells a story of emergence as you are traveling through this realm and descending into its reset.
Thanks. And Scott, your story of coming to the project?
How I came to do this piece, again, I hadn't worked in VR at all up to this point. I was working at Jason Lewis's and Scaunati's lab in IF at the time. And they asked me to do one of the pieces, and I jumped at the chance just because I do a lot of digital image making already. So I was eager to sort of like see what VR possibilities with VR. So it took a little while to consider what I wanted to do. Like 150 years in the future was a little ambiguous to me, and I didn't really want to do a typical sci-fi kind of piece. So one of the considerations I had is like, well, I considered 150 years in the past, and then sort of try to make a mental map of where we are as Anishinaabe people, and what that path, how could we have conceived where we are today 150 years ago. And one of the things, one of the aspects that it always come back to, and I consider this a lot, and I spend a lot of time like relearning Anishinaabemowin, and so I consider what the language can talk about in terms of the future, and so the whole blueberry part, and it wasn't initially it wasn't supposed to be the title, but you know how working titles are, they end up just being the title. So, but it was that word, because when I was first, I guess when I was like 18, I was at Children of the Earth in Winnipeg, and I remember one of the language teachers, we were going through the interesting words, and the first time I heard blueberry pie, I'm not going to try to say it in Anishinaabemowin because I'll just embarrass myself, but it was a shockingly long word. We all kind of giggled because it was a word made up of other parts of words, you know? It was like describing the things in the pie and the pie itself. And so I sort of considered that, you know, like 200 years ago, we didn't have blueberry pies, but we had blueberries. And so the idea that the language sort of evolves and can bring us into the future in a different way. So from there, I sort of, I wanted to work with some language elders, and Alan Corbier is sitting in the front row. And so I got to work with him out of Manitoulin Island, Miching First Nations. And also worked with Roger Roulette in Winnipeg and some of the speakers out there. And so what I wanted to do was like look at words from the future. And so the concept behind it, the story that sort of couches all of this is that one of our origin stories is that, or I was told from people out of Winnipeg, is that like we came from the sky. Like we originally came from a hole in the sky, which is sort of, I guess, around the Pleiades system. And that story is that Spider Woman lowered down a spider web to Earth, and that's how we came down as the original people, Anishinaabe. So that interpretation for me was like that could be like a wormhole. You know, we traveled through space and came to this Earth like this. And so the concept was going back to that wormhole and like hearing the original Anishinaabemowin. And so those words would have been different because they're describing different relationships with with the environment and the land that we originally came from. And so I wanted to work with language speakers to sort of consider how words are going to be put together. And so like I worked with Alan, and Alan worked with a group of elders to like consider words like event horizon or black hole, you know? It wasn't just a literal black hole, but it was like, what is our relationship to light or gravity, or what is our relationship with the world with those sort of concepts? And so he helped sort of consider these things. And so we built these narratives in the scenes around sort of the idea that you're hearing like future Anishinaabenwan or unheard Anishinaabenwan from the future, which is really the future. It's just basically hundreds of years, light years away, which is sort of simultaneously happening. So, yeah. So that's how I came to it. And so it was like all these different elements sort of played into the piece.
I love that. I love that so much. So how did the medium of VR relate to that construction of language? Did it facilitate it? How did they speak to each other in terms of creation of the piece or the words?
Well, I think the immersive quality, so I was very lucky. I worked with a language speaker, a young woman, Teresa, out in Manitoba, Winnipeg. And so she did the voiceovers. So if you hear her voice, that's her voice. Both in one ear, you'll hear the English translation directly at the same time as the Anishinaabenwan translation. And so when I first heard it, her voice is so, like, there's something about, like, magical about her voice. Like, I just love it so much. I spent hours just listening to it. And so I didn't know how integrated that would become until I actually put on the headset and see the environment. But it was like something about just hearing that language so close to your ears while you have that experience, that it was just sort of this integrated piece. And you know, it was happy accident, I guess. But it wasn't, I can't really plan for those things. So.
Let's contextualize the project within the larger 150. Danis, if we can get your comments. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion this year. We're nearing the end of 2057, the end of the sesquicentennial. We've had a lot of conversations. Many people have had a lot of conversations about this topic. Can you just share your thoughts in terms of situating the hunt, the work, this project within this larger 150?
Yeah, I don't think I really thought that much about that part of things at all. Like, I was just very excited to imagine the future. I think that's a powerful thing. I mean, if we look at colonization, people talk a lot about the impacts of colonization in terms of how that plays out as so many challenges are in our communities, like poverty and you know, missing and murdered Indigenous women, and just the really incredibly negative effects. But one thing that that I'm interested in is how it has affected our abilities to imagine. The colonization of imagining. And so to me, imagining is a very powerful and political act. So like the whole, you know, kind of box of Canada 150 is like, who cares about that? Like personally, it was just like, that's not, you know, that, like to me, I was just wanted to imagine what our futures could be. And in this case, it was a Mohawk project, which is not my nation, so I'm an insider coming into that. And so the first thing I did was reach out to my friend Zoe Hopkins, who lives on Six Nations, and I said, I'm interested in doing a project because I've now lived as a guest on this land for over 15 years, and you know, I was hoping to do a project that about where I live now, and so I just called her and said, "What do you think about this?" And like, tell me honestly if you think it. So I sent her a first script, but I wasn't. So we started talking, and then very quickly I brought on Ryan DeCare, who's a language specialist, and it's amazing to work with people who work in the language, because, you know, like a translator is not at all a satisfying term for what they bring to projects. And as a Cree filmmaker, my dad is a language speaker, and I talk to him about every single project that I do, not just to, you know, for translation purposes, if you know, because I often have Cree in all of my films, but also for concepts, to really start to think about how it might be thought of from a Cree perspective. And because I don't have the language, I talk to him and we just talk about concepts. I'll just hit a record button and we'll just start talking about concepts so I can start to think about them philosophically, and grapple with the philosophy. And there is so much history embedded in the language. So part of my dad's work is he tracks historical events and how things changes through how the language changed, which is really amazing work. So I started working with Ryan DeCare, who's a Mohawk language speaker, and he was amazing. Like, he did everything from come to a read-in with, or like a read-through with all of the actors who were all Mohawk, but not all of them were language speakers, and he helped coach how it would be said, but also would think really deeply about, like, conceptually about, like if there was a word that he wasn't sure about the translation or to think about it, he called elders. He was based in Wata, but he would call elders in Ganasatake and then in Six Nations to really kind of come to a consensus about how this would be approached. And I just cannot thank him enough for bringing that to the project, because I can't bring that as someone that is from outside of that community. And we also shot on Six Nations, which was really important, and all of the actors were Mohawk. And like a lot of times I just think, man, we're Indigenous filmmakers or artists or whatever. We're just doing our own thing, Canada's whatever. And we and it's complicated because we live in this country, we're a part of Canada, we navigate all of that, but there's always something that sits there unreconciled. Like Canada 150 just sat there like a big unreconciled mess in my experience, and I don't really have much to say or think about it. I just really appreciated all of the people that got really political about it and really pushed back. That's necessary. We have to do that. I respect people who just ducked down and avoided it. I respect people who wanted to celebrate it, because it is complicated being an Indigenous person in this country. And I think we just need to be kind to each other, be inclusive about how we want to respond to each other. I don't really criticize anyone for how they respond to it. I just feel really grateful for those that, took this as a moment to hold Canada's feet to the fire and say, what have you been doing here? And what is the future going to look like? Because you have to take responsibility for this as well as us. But for us as artists, we have the freedom to imagine anything. And that's a beautiful thing,
It is. It's incredible. One of the favorite things about this project for me and my job in general is you can come up with these ideas, but then you turn it over to artists and they do something far more extraordinary and imaginative and powerful than you could even imagine. So thanks for the comments, and thanks to all of you guys for that. Raven had mentioned, in our previous conversation too, there was this idea of this creating a relic, the relic of the present for the future, and how that resonates throughout all of your works. Raven, can you dig a bit deeper into that specifically? And maybe if you can share some thoughts too, as a US-based arts collective, this idea that we proposed to you about a quasi-acknowledgement of Canada's sesquicentennial.
Yeah, our piece wasn't about Canada at all. We didn't really have any consideration or, to be honest, interest in talking about Canada. But what we still wanted to think about the 150, and what the way I like to look at that is when Canada is celebrating its 150th birthday, that it's recognizing its own mortality, and perhaps it's seeing itself as no longer existing sometime in the future. That's the only reason, at least with Navajo people and my family, that that's the only time we talk about years, is when somebody's saying, well, I've lived this long, I'm this many years old today, and I won't be here. These are the amount of days I don't have left, maybe. There's a double number there. I'm 40 years old, maybe I'm halfway there, right? And And so we wanted to think about that. We wanted to think outside of the nation having its own mortality, and this far into the future, which actually isn't that far, 150 more years, maybe there's no more of these nations. And where does that put Indigenous people? We've in our VR experience, we have this relic, which reminds you that somebody or something is existing, whatever form that takes. You all probably saw Blade Runner already, and those kinds of things we were thinking about. You know, how can we evolve? What does that mean? Are we existing? What agency do we have if we're still existing? And back to what I was saying before, what agency do we have to facilitate our own reset, even our own forfeiting, if that's what it has to be? So those are the kind of questions we had when we were making this, and those are the kinds of questions we have in our work. Is that future that we are imagining, and perhaps that's cyclical, perhaps that is anticipating a complete renewal and starting over.
So by reset, is it like a reboot or renewal? Can you speak a bit more specifically about that idea of a reset?
Yeah, I don't know. I suppose it could be very bleak if we wanted to think of that as a complete starting over, but Indigenous people still being Indigenous people, but maybe defining what that is, and instead of being in a retrograde situation of looking backwards to only see ourselves in the future. But as far as how I personally envision that reset, I don't know. I don't know what would survive. I don't know if language would be something that should survive after a reset. All of those things might be in conflict with the agency that Indigenous people have to determine their own reset.
Again, in envisioning or imagining what you would create collectively, and you worked independently from each other, so there weren't necessarily artistic constraints, there were some technical constraints that we had. And Danis and Raven, I mean, I was curious in terms of what would be the output. Would it be utopic? Would it be dystopic? Would it be something completely different? Do you buy into this idea of a utopia or a dystopia, and how would you describe the future in your individual works?
It's so funny because when I set out to make the project, I was sort of like, man, it would be so cool if we did a utopian vision of the future. Like, that would be amazing. And then Trump got elected. And I was like, shit. And I just was like, I can't do it. Like, I was just in fighting mode. I was just like, fuck you. Like, it's just like, no, I can't do it. And so much of our experience is pushing hard against the pervasiveness of colonization. And I couldn't remove myself out of that mode at that particular moment because it was so important to push back. It was so important to stand up and declare, this is so messed up. This is so wrong. This is, a white supremacist backlash, and we have to do everything we can to stand for what we value right now. So I had to go dystopian, and which is fun anyway, because what it is just like honestly a slight exaggeration of the dystopia that we're seeing right now in this particular era, which is there are really scary things happening, and so only a slight exaggeration of that. So in my piece, it imagines a dystopian future in which orbs, are like flying balls, are law enforcement, and they're they enforce the laws of the state. And so you find a family out hunting on the land, and an orb comes in to enforce their right to hunt there. And so you see a man talking to an orb and saying, we're Mohawk people and we have the right to hunt and on our land. And then a woman, I'm sorry, I don't know if everyone's seen it, so spoilers. But and then a woman pops up and she shoots it down with her laser crossbow, and And whether or not the viewer picks it up or not, it's my intent that what they're actually doing is setting a trap for the orbs, so that they're capturing them. And then at the end, you go back to the camp with this group of people, and you see a whole operation of a woman who takes the orb, and at the very end, the main woman who shot down the orb goes into a room where there's all these orbs on the ground, and then commands them, and they rise up into a new Mohawk fleet, which is really what I've been feeling about where we're heading right now, and what's been so exciting to me, and what imagineNATIVE so beautifully fosters is a whole fleet of us that are going to bring the power of our imagination and really take back what's ours. And also that, like, it's been so inspiring to see what's happening, like, on social media and with youth. And, like, certainly when Idle No More happened a few years ago, to me, it changed something forever that could never be taken back from us. Standing Rock, I know that everyone's hoping for a good outcome, and then Trump comes in, but we still won something at Standing Rock, and it was this power of coming together and saying, no, we want different, we want to do better, we demand better. And then there's such a power of coming together and standing together like that, that changes something that can never be taken back. And also, people are using technology now in ways that we haven't. We have a voice on social media. We're taking people to task. We saw that in the whole cultural appropriation debate that happened. We're not silenced anymore. And so in my piece, I really wanted to show that it was the ingenious, creativity of this small community living under the dystopia that is colonization, and using the technology for their own benefit and fighting back against the state to do that. So it was, super fun way to approach all of that.
Again, we wanted, there was a tendency to want to make something dystopian when making this project. At the same time, we didn't want to steer ourselves into that didactic possibility that would happen if we did that. So again, everything is ambiguous when you experience our piece, in that you're not sure if this was something that was done to you or your people, or it was a controlled burn, let's say. And so again, it goes back to the agency, questioning the agency and considering the agency that Indigenous people would have in the future. And that might look dystopic, it might look like the world is burning, but who allowed that to happen, or who caused that to happen, or where do we see ourselves amongst those ashes?
And Scott, for you, I guess of the three, and probably in the most simplistic terms, one could call yours utopic, in a way. I'm curious about your thoughts on that and this idea. It's a journey.
I don't think it's either. I don't think it's utopic or dystopic. I think it's. I guess where I was coming from is like I was considering, and I often consider sort of like psychological implications of these things, right? Like, so that experience going back home to a future, going back home to a future, what is that psychological impact to us? Like, what is that? So I think, like, I was thinking that when they were talking about dystopia, utopia, is like, and couching that in terms of a personal term, like that personal process of a lifespan. Like, I think there's dystopic elements and there's utopic elements in all of our futures. And on a very like personal psychological level, I think perhaps that's what maybe my piece was more about, in terms of not so much literally 150 years in the future, but like where we are as people individually and personally, and that movement forward. So
There's an amazing line that has always stayed with me from your piece, Scott, and it was, I'm probably paraphrasing here, and it's about going through the wormhole and our bodies change because of the different gravity, but also our minds and our thoughts change because of it too. Where did that come from?
Yeah, again, it was more just, I spent a lot of time just sitting there thinking. So, I mean, part of those things is like, I was trying to imagine what that would be like. And you know, typically you see there's that sort of, the stars sort of stream out. And so there's visual languages of going through wormholes. There's a little bit of that in there, but I think when I was trying to consider what that experience would be, it would be mostly this huge psychological sort of pressures and impacts on you. Like most of the stuff that transit would be sort of psychic and psychological more than just a physical sort of movement from one place to another. So I just considered what that would feel like, and I sort of considered those elements. So.
And did that bit come from the consultations with the language speakers, or is that again just your personal artistic process?
That was mostly my artistic process. Like I spent a lot of time considering sort of psychological implications of things and processes. So, but again, it ties into the language bit in terms of what is our relationship to these ideas, right? Like what is our relationship to the land or to the environment or to the emotions that we have, you know? So I think it all kind of plays in terms of how I approached incorporating the language or incorporating the visuals or incorporated the ideas. So.
And in terms of the starting point of your work, the starting point of the wormhole, can you give some context in case people aren't familiar with?
Oh, you mean just the opening scene, or what is
the
the
structure?
structure?
And the shaking.
Oh yeah, so I was like, this was in talking with friends, and so one of the sort of really old ceremonies we have is a shaking tent ceremony, and those ideas, like when you go into that shaking tent, you ask that person, and he can see or she can see things at a far distance, you know. And for me, that was like, that's whether you're in the next room or you're in the next universe. I think that space is no longer relevant, you know. That distance is no longer relevant. And I thought that's a good sort of, all of our old people that used to do those ceremonies and still do those ceremonies have that ability to sort of access these wormholes, whether they're physically leaving these places or not, but psychically they have that connection still. So I wanted to incorporate that kind of element. And
another piece that I really loved about your piece, Scott, was the teapot. I think that at least they're on my reserve, they're on every reserve I've been to, and that kind of imagery. Why did you put those in there?
Well, it was one of the earliest sort of ideas, and I wanted to like little touchstones, and I thought like when you're going through like huge psychological stresses and stuff, that imagery will pop up that will sort of ground you, you know. And I thought, what's more human and what's more sort of grounded in this world than say something like a teapot? And I thought, for me, that was sort of like a, you know, the Rorschach test, or like what is the first thing you think of when, and the teapot was that. And I work with Scalinotti, and so she heard that, and so she eagerly brought me a teapot from her house. And so there's these little connections, and I wasn't, and I just really wanted to keep those in there throughout the whole process. So there's just sort of like the human touchstone of, amidst sort of these abstract experience. So.
Let's switch gears a bit and talk about the actual production of these things. Each of you has made different types of work, mostly, I mean, in terms of screen-based work, it's mostly been 2D, single-channel type work. What was that process like? Raven, let's start with you on this one. In terms of, again, that process of visioning this different type of medium, and how, if at all, it changed the way that you envisioned a story. Aside from really just the practical of a 360 environment, was there a different process of creation with the collective, or was it something, again, that you went to, was the learning curve a technical one, or was it also an artistic one?
Yeah, as I was saying before, that we hadn't had very much experience with VR or gaming or any of that kind of experience. Postcommodity does work with video, and so we were considering that at one point, but at the same time wanted to take advantage of the team that at OBX and Concordia, and so at the same time we knew that the animation was never going to be enough. We knew it was never going to look real, so we wanted to maybe exploit those limitations of the technology. and go use that as a starting point of how we can maybe, for lack of a better word, break the experience that you're having. And parts you believe maybe that it's glitching out or that you are being steered into this railed experience, which was a really nice part of using this medium. And Danis's piece does it really well, where you're on this railed experience, but then it kind of plays with your point of view, so thinking of ways that the technology, the VR technology and its 360 capabilities can do those kinds of things. But the process, we did a lot of experimenting. I think this could have gone a completely different way. I mean, we did some storyboarding. We did a lot of audio experiments that didn't end up in the piece. We actually drew a bunch of characters that didn't end up in the piece either. So, and at the same time too, we're still wondering if this is a post-commodity work. I mean, it exists. It's very unlike our other work, but we've been contextualizing it as, we don't have the one Canada 150 thing, but we've been thinking of these other markers that are happening in the United States. There's a marker of 2043, which is when white people become the minority in the United States. That's what the census has projected. So this might be another marker. It's 2167 in a timeline that Postcommodity is imagining of telling some kind of future story.
What do you mean by questioning whether it was a post-commodity work?
Well, I mean, a work in and of itself. I think it's going to be part of a larger work that is going to exist. I don't think it's, I don't know if we're ready to call it just its own work at this time, its own piece. I think it's going to be a component to a much bigger thing that we're developing, which is exciting.
I want to see that. And Danis, for you, I mean, you worked in live action as opposed to animation. Can you answer the same question and then also speak to just how different it was to storyboard or create something like this versus films?
Yeah, so I make fiction films up to this point. So yeah, it was completely different. Like, it doesn't even feel like it's the medium of film at all. Like, it's because all of the tools that you use in film that are most powerful, like editing and also the frame, because the frame is what tells the story and it tells you what you're relating to and when. And so in 360 video, obviously, the viewer can look anywhere. So if you're, I mean, to me, VR had made sense if it was something like an immersive installation or possibly an immersive documentary, or just placing someone in an abstract world. But I'd seen a lot of VR and felt like a lot of it was spectacle. And so or as a game, I can understand, like, you're like, whoa, you're like, rocking out with superheroes and like it's really fun. But like, so it was more of like an experience. But I was really curious about narrative, just curious, like, because I'd never seen it work all that well, and I don't really know if it even works I feel like that question has yet to be answered. So I don't really know that I came up with an answer, but I wanted to try to at least attempt to have the viewers follow along something, like even a little vignette. And I also wanted to shoot live action because I'm just really curious about like, when I make work that is about the future, I like it to feel grounded in reality. So I'm always looking for that, like playing with the idea of where realism meets something fantastical. So I didn't want to be totally immersed in either an abstract or a fantastical world, or in something that was animated. Or a lot of VR also has like a video game aesthetic, so you feel like you're sort of in a game. So I decided to shoot live action and then just add some elements to it, like, so animate within. So I worked with a team called Electric Square that ended up doing, like, bringing the orb to life, or like sending those fake geese like flying through the sky or whatever. And that part of it was just really fun. But yeah, like the power of editing, to feel that you don't have that tool as a filmmaker makes you feel like you're cut off at the knees. Like I was like, I kept like sort of, as a very frustrating, in a good way, but like it was just like, oh my God, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to tell a story in this. And then also just technology wise, there's still a lot of glitches in the process. So it's just like altogether arduous in a lot of ways. But yeah, so I wanted to see if I could actually create focal points where people would be looking where they should be looking at a certain time, or not even should, but like that they would catch enough of it as it went along. Because all of the VR I'd seen was pretty unsophisticated. Like with narrative, the best thing that you could hope for is that you're immersed in the story. And to do that, all of the ways in which you're being directed should hopefully feel invisible. And in VR that I'd watched, it was like, look over yonder where the crows, and then you go, what? Like, and it's like so unsophisticated, and it was just like, no way. Yeah, like I was hoping to direct people just by being in the world and then seeing geese fly overhead and then seeing an orb, and hopefully they would just follow where the action was happening. And I don't know, you guys have to tell me if that happened, but yeah, that was sort of what I was just, it just felt to me like a giant experiment of like totally, you know, not knowing how any of it would work or feel. And I also wanted a moving camera because I couldn't imagine like being locked off. So we built this rig that we strapped to the actors, and we did a lot of tests with it. And then also I did tests with, like in traditional film, you have like a close-up, a medium shot, and in VR you don't have that, but you do sort of have it depending on where the distance is, the subject is away from the camera. So I did some of that testing. It was rushed. I feel like my biggest kind of like the biggest tragedy of like what the piece ends up being is that the resolution, it's still where the technology is, doesn't quite pick up. Like I had these amazing actors like Devery Jacobs and like Brandon Oakes and Zoe and her son, and they were all in the movie, and they were amazing, and yet like you can't quite see their expressions and like all of the work that they did to really sell the story. So I feel like that's what didn't quite capture. But yeah, like, so anyway, we built this rig, and we were gonna like shoot the whole thing like that. Like people always say that you can get motion sickness if the camera moves, but I started to see a lot of artists that were moving the camera now, so I wanted to see if we could do that. But the rig we had ended up creating an aesthetic that was very extreme because it holds the actor in close-up in an extreme angle, kind of like if anyone's seen Requiem for a Dream, like Darren Aronofsky straps the camera in a similar way for particular scenes, and it creates a very extreme feeling that doesn't work for scenes like just casually walking up to camp and saying hello, you know. I ended up using the rig, but only for the final scene, which I feel like the aesthetic matched what I was hoping to achieve in that scene the most. But the rest of the time, I did end up having to lock off the camera, which means that I was painted out of the scenes at the end, because you have to be able to watch what's going on when you're directing live action, and there's no monitor, which is crazy. So like you're just like, you're literally in the scene. I was like hiding behind a hay bale, like with my head up in the first scene, and then they had to paint hay over my head after, and like, yeah, anyway. So yay, fun times. Yeah.
Did you get a credit for that? Hay bale one.
Yeah, hay bale number one. Yeah.
And for yourself, Scott, I mean, coming into this, creative challenges, technical challenges.
Yeah, so primarily I come in from a visual arts background. And I guess I didn't feel like the process was really make something, put on the headset, how does it make me feel, you know? And so is it working, is pacing okay? Like, so it was like one of those sort of real sort of organic processes, you know? So there's a lot of iterations of it. There's tons of like scenes that got cut out, and it wasn't working. So, but I found it, like, now considering it, when people were talking, it's like, I kind of feel like when you set up a show at a gallery, or just say, like, you consider 3D space all the time, like composition of the space, how things are laid out, sort of designed to make you feel how you read that show. So I feel like you kind of feel like, I think it comes through in the work because it doesn't. You don't have to look any one way. There's something to look at no matter how you're in that experience. So, but yeah, there was just a lot of experimenting and a lot of sort of, and that's the fun part of it. Like to like go out and I also was learning how to make this stuff too. Like I learned how to use Unity and Blender and all those things to in the process. So yeah, it was one of those experimental, organic sort of experiences. So.
One of the things we often hear attributed to VR is its intimacy, its immersive quality with these things. What are your thoughts on that? Do you really feel it's immersive? I mean, is it a game changer, in as we hear so often?
Yeah, I think it can be. I think one of the brilliant things is that it can be anything that you can put in there. Like it's you really technically, your skills technically are your limitation, you know. So, I mean, for me, I'm starting to see this the medium as sort of a site-specific portal. You know, that could be anything. It's just a matter of how you sort of integrate that into your art practice. Yeah. But yeah, I think it's very important, intimate. It's very intimate. So.
I think at the end of this, we're still skeptical of the technology. I don't know if the tools can accurately portray reality, and so there needs to be creative solutions to that exploits those limitations. I think to provide some other kind of immersive experience or more realistic experience. A big part of my skepticism is accessibility. We made these things, and we hope Indigenous people from our communities can see them, but it requires a phone, it requires the headset, I don't know how many people will get to experience this kind of thing, especially at the rate of how fast the technology moves and how quickly it can go obsolete. And you might look at any one of our VR things in a few years, and I don't know what it'll look like, yeah, like so yeah, we're still when Postcommodity is thinking about this work that we made, we're trying to see where it fits in, and if there's a meta critique even that that can happen with it, or where we can take this piece next, or what we can do with it. But yeah, I mean, at the same time, it is exciting. I think how the phone, which we're all tied to, was integrated into this technology. Previously, it was the big headset, and it's connected to a PC desktop computer, and now that there is that mobility, I mean, we were working on this one time, and we're in the car driving. The driver wasn't wearing the headset, but we were taking turns, and that you could do that and have that mobility was interesting.
Yeah, I feel like I'm still in the skeptic camp a little bit. And it was probably just because of what I'm interested in making, and I think. If anything, artists will define what this medium can be. I think it still does, technology-wise, need to get a little further along. There's potentially really exciting things to be done in this medium, I think, and I think we will see where it goes. But I think it's also, as it all happens, who's in control of this technology is a really important question, because when we came into it, I actually did an open immersion lab last year that was with the CFC and the NFB, and it was a bunch of Indigenous artists doing this lab with also Black artists from the US. And it was really cool for all of us to get into a space and start talking about it, because I'd seen a lot of VR pieces that are like, wow, like go into this, Amazon tribe and like sit by the fire with an elder and like experience like, the old exotic colonial gaze is now playing out in a hyper immersive environment. Which, I mean, we've been having these talks at imagineNATIVE, and also within documentary, I think talks a lot about ethics and, who's gaze. And I think VR, also has to be very engaged. Like to talk about this medium, we have to keep talking about these issues. And when we came into the space, like when we did this lab, we were matched with VR production companies to help us like kind of make not a finished thing, but like a prototype. And there was a lot of tensions between the artists and these like VR production companies, because they're basically commercial house. It would be like saying to an artist like, oh yeah, we're gonna like match you up with a company that has all the tools to do what you want to do. And you're like all excited. They're like, yeah, it's an ad agency. And you're just like we don't really, like, we're not really, like, it was, so there was a lot of tensions. They also didn't realize, like the people we were working with were, like really skeptical of our processes as well. Like we'd be like, no, we have to spend a lot of time editing this, and they get really frustrated. Because again, it's sort of like if you want to bring storytelling into this and not just like, whoa, I'm on like a cool spaceship and like, bleh. Yeah, I don't know. It's just like felt like really kind of like, I don't know, maybe the stereotype of like gamers, or like it felt very male dominated. And I was doing that lab with like a bunch of kick-ass women, and it's like, yeah, we just of course push back against all of it, but yeah, it was just an interesting space to experiment with, because I think the independent creator or the artist in VR hasn't really, I think the support is just starting to happen now, and I think that's where the cool shit is gonna go down.
Well said. And that's a great way to look forward to. We'll start with the Q&A session now. If we can have the house lights, please. But it is an interesting conversation, this idea about empathy VR and how VR and certain VR experiences can heighten a sense of empathy, but certainly a lot of danger is around that.
Or a heightened sense of sympathy,
Yeah.
which is like, can often come with still being patronizing,
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah.
So it's really important for us to parse all this stuff out.
We'll take some questions. Do we need to have microphones for? Yes, we do. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and the volunteer. There's one up front here. Hi, Shirley.
Raven, I don't get it either. I just feel like I'm at the beginning of when I got my first PC, and I was afraid to do it because I was going to break it or something. And so I think we have a long ways to go, but I think it can be a pretty powerful tool. So are you guys going to do something else now that you know how to do it? You're going to do more? Do you have more story ideas?
Postcommodity doesn't have any more plans to do any more VR. But maybe if the right project came along, we would try to extend this particular idea that we were working with here. But yeah, no plans as of yet. But we're interested in seeing where it goes. You know, another part of our skepticism is why things evolve. Who will make VR evolve? And of course, our thinking is it's probably going to be the adult video industry, or maybe gambling will be integrated into something with money, right? And it's not going to be educational. It's not going to be teachers making this thing progress, unfortunately. But that's where artists and teachers, and artists who are teachers, can maybe latch onto that. But they're yeah, as Danis is saying too, I don't know. We have to get over our skepticism if we want to continue that.
What was the question? Sorry.
If you have any VR projects in the works or hope to make some.
Yeah, so I'm doing an MFA at Concordia, and so I've incorporated VR into some of the practice. But one of the things to talk about is that there is that choke point. Like right now, if you don't have the skills, if you don't know the medium, and you're just hiring people to do it for you, then their skill set will be the limitation, which is frustrating. And I think that's why there's a lot of skepticism. Once the artists decide they're going to learn that or take that skill set and run with it, then that's more of a freedom. So I'm at that point in terms of I can sit down and make a piece if I need to. So I think my skepticism isn't so high. And so yeah, I think there's legs there, and I'm kind of excited to see where that goes. So yeah, there is some projects in the works. Yeah.
I don't have any VR projects in the works, but I feel like I don't know, maybe I'd come back to it, but not like right away. Like I'd want almost like some things to be worked out first, honestly.
We have another question up here.
Hi, this is sort of for Danis, but I guess for anyone. When you talked about the experience of getting together with this this very male space of the tech design, I'm based in New York, and mostly in the past year, I don't know if you guys know Marco Antonio Castro Cosio, who ran the Media Lab at the Metropolitan Museum. But since he's left there, he's a TED fellow, but he's been bringing together this collective of the tech companies based in New York with artists. I've been to a few of the meetings, but they're trying to get, I think it's the tech companies, specifically focused in VR. So it's a VR-based group, and he's trying to facilitate a better working relationship with the tech people in the art space to mitigate some of those challenges. But also, I've seen a lot of these VR development companies in New York trying to make a space too for artists, like, hey, you guys come in and just use our equipment for free. I mean, it's trying to figure out the symbiotic relationship. And so I feel like maybe there's some hope there. And I don't know if you guys come to New York, but I would encourage you to connect with that group if they can provide some assistance. Or
Thank you. Question back here.
Hi, this is a question for any one of you. I just was very curious because you're all artists who work in ways normally your work is experienced by groups of people, whether it's in a gallery or whether it's in a cinema. And I just wondered if for your creative process, when you were thinking about working in VR, does it change the way you think about storytelling or what you wanted to do when you're thinking about the viewer experiencing it essentially alone? Because that's kind of an interesting philosophical area about entertainment with VR. Like it seems kind of alienating in one way and immersive in another. And I just wondered if that influenced your creative process.
I think I can answer your question. We struggled a little bit with that. We work, most of Postcommodity's work is in the installation medium. And so we thought at one point that we might make this an installation where you are having an experience with this headset, but at the same time you are a performer. People are watching you move and you're being steered in the very real world because of what's happening on your VR experience. And this would become a performance to other people waiting in line to get on the headset. And you had this ongoing cycle, and maybe there'd be a room and everything. So we thought of that as a solution to I think what you're asking. And if we felt limited because it was just a solitary experience, we also looked into the possibilities of if there were ways to link multiple headsets or experiences so that I could be wearing my headset and Scott is wearing his, and we see each other, hey, inside of the thing. And the technology isn't there yet, at least with the tools we were using. But something like that, maybe, we would have come up with a much different piece if we were able to do that.
Yeah, I don't know that it changed my creative process at all, but I think just more, I don't know, the accessibility thing that Raven brought up earlier is just a concern generally, like who gets to see the work, because if you are not based in Toronto and can come to like an international film festival, or you don't have the technology, who is the work really for? And so to me, it's just a shame. And also just like, wanting to be in a theater and having a collective experience with people. Like, yeah, I mean, I haven't really reconciled any of those questions, but I think they're just there.
Yeah, I don't think it changes much for me. If you're installing a piece at a gallery, the best way to experience that is singularly and alone in the gallery. So I don't think it changes much. And for accessibility, I think it's, for myself at least, I mean, if it is part of a gallery show, then you don't need to have, I wouldn't imagine these things that you put it on at home and experience it, but it is in like a gallery or an arts context, so.
Right here.
Hi, my name's Anthony. So thank you for being here. You're all awesome. The first thing I want to say is I don't know if any of you have heard of Google Cardboard, but it's a $20 VR set that uses an iPhone, which is pretty sweet. So just if anyone's working in VR, that's a good workaround for the cost of like having an Oculus Rift headset, which costs like $2,000. So I'm interested in VR because I think it's a really interesting tool to bring the youth into stories of our traditional stories in a new way, right? Like young people, gone are the days of sitting around the fire listening to an elder talk, like because we live in cities now and fires are illegal and like all these really weird things, right? And also a lot of people choose not to do that, instead be on their phone. So I think VR is an access point to talk to youth about culture. And I'm working on bringing people to sacred sites that they can't visit because of monetary reasons. Like I'm fortunate enough to travel, but a lot of people can't even, pay gas to go from Saddle Lake to Edmonton, which is a 2-hour drive. But then one of the concerns I have is that when you put on a VR headset and you go into this immersive environment and then you take it off and you walk down the street, you're kind of like, this is boring. Like VR is way cooler. It is cool to be, oh, what a cool spaceship. Like, wow, things are flying at me. So how do we, as artists, create that balance of like, it is an incredible tool. Like anyone who's put on VR walks away like, holy cow, like that was awesome. But how do we balance that between taking the headset off and having that person leave from the experience like a changed person or a more curious person without feeling that regular life is boring?
Who wants to take that one?
I don't know that it's much different from when you made the jump from books to radio to film. Like, the concerns are kind of all the same. It's like, no, I never want to listen to radio again because film is so much better, So I think, I don't know that it's such a big, but maybe for you, that was such a big thing that life now sucks. But but I don't know that it's that. It might be a concern, but I think it was a concern, like, too much TV, for young kids and how they're ever going to cope with the violence and stuff. But I don't know if that is a concern. Like, I guess we'll have to wait and see. Generations, another 10 years.
I don't have much to add, but I don't know if the jump is that great anymore because people are taking off their VR headsets and just looking at their phone all day. So I don't know if the jump is there like it was. I don't know if VR is the same experience it was 10 years ago when we're immersed in our phones already. These phones are our headsets now, and they'll probably outlast VR. They'll augment reality instead of having us seek virtual reality.
I just read this article about how addictive social media was designed to be, and how some of the early designers of the like button in Facebook, and then also the like press and scroll, like when you scroll to refresh, it works the way like a gambling slot machine does, because it creates like a little hit. And so I feel like the addictive question is already here with our phones. For me, like the power of a medium like VR is if you get artists involved, or if you are using it as a cultural learning opportunity, then, if youth want to have an immersive, that raises all kinds of questions, but if youth wanted to be at a sacred site and they spent that time in a VR, experience doing that, as opposed to like the 5 minutes they would have spent addicted to their phone, and like I'm addicted to my phone. So I feel like this question is already totally there. So to me, if we can put content that is created by us, for us, that people can experience, that's going to be a good thing.
That's a nice necklace, by the way. Medallion.
It is a great medallion. We have a question back here. Hello.
I saw quite a bit of VR work in Australia last year, and one of the projects worried me a lot. It was a scan of a historic coin. The coin was no bigger than, I don't know, a dollar coin here. But you could walk through it, which was an amazing experience. But what it allowed me to do as a viewer, as a as the audience, is to experience that coin from a very different angle. So I saw things that the sculptor of that coin never really wanted the audience to see. For example, there was a man with a hat, wide-brimmed hat, and you could walk under that and you could see the actual face. So he'd sculpted the face, but he never wanted you to see it because it was tiny. I guess from an artistic point of view, an artist's point of view, how do you feel about that? And has your experience in VR started you wondering about the role of the viewer being able to manipulate the experience that you create maybe in years, a number of years' time, where the technology allows people to experience things in a very different way than we can now, if that makes sense.
I don't know that, like, I think we're talking about, like, this technology is going to be obsolete within, 2 or 3 years. So I'm not worried that somebody in 10 years' time will be able to put on a headset and see it even. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's the same from a physical, because it's not a sculpture, it's not a painting. So I don't know that it's not a concern from my point of view. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like the ethics of our, ownership, really. And, I think it's, we talk about ownership a lot. I mean, for myself personally, I also struggle sometimes with, like, the notion of the artist as being, like, even within film, there's kind of the auteur theory, and it's very individualistic. So I don't personally feel all that precious about, like, oh, it was intended to, but I think you have to look at these things as a case-by-case basis, because it's kind of like, whose intention, because there's a lot of artists that actually disrupt, like Kent Monkman, for example, who's made one of the works, Honor Song, like he, re-inhabits and reimagines, like, colonial spaces all the time, and that's a very powerful intervention. And so I think it's like all of these things need to be debated on a case-by-case basis, like who's doing the intervening, and why.
First off, I commend all of you for stepping into the realm. It's vulnerable and tricky and amazing, and we're at the stage where you're pioneering the work. So that's pretty incredible, just in general. So I just learned that you could turn VR pieces or 360 pieces into flatties. Or two-dimensional. Would you consider that for your works?
You can turn, I don't know, you can turn VR into 2D? What does that look like? Like, I've seen a flat screen within the 360 space.
Sure, so the audience person gets orientated basically by how you situate your lens with the viewer. So you could just choose as a director what component of that you want.
Actually, I think I know what you're talking about. When I was doing the lab, there was this one app that was a tool where you could be watching a 2D video, and it would literally go "Rrr," and then become 360, and you could go in between the two. So I don't know if we're talking about the same thing, but it was really cool. Because you could take old documentary footage, for example, and then I don't know what they were doing, but I hadn't thought about that aspect of it, and I think just the timeline and resources didn't allow us to investigate that, but it certainly looked very awesome. And the piece that I saw from Australia, a VR piece called Collisions, you're in this space with an elder in Australia, and at a certain point they're showing us archival footage in the documentary, and it is staged as a screen that everybody in the 360 environment is watching, so you and the viewer can watch the 2D footage as well. So I think there's a lot of experimentation that is probably yet to happen that could be really fun and awesome.
Are there any other questions from here? Downstairs in the digital media arcade, or actually not downstairs, just down the hall by the bathrooms, is imagineNATIVE's digital media arcade. We have two VR works there. We have Impossible to Contain, a 360 video by Zoe Hopkins, and West Wind by Jeff Barnaby. 2167, the 4 works are downstairs in the lobby here at the Lightbox until December. Check the website or our catalog for full details about it. Thank you for coming, and please join me in thanking the artists in attendance today.
Thanks for coming out.